All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Liz Svoboda. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian here at the University of Michigan Flint's Thompson Library. And today we're going to be doing a session in our Project Management and Publishing series talking about how to make your graduate thesis accessible. Now, even though this is really aimed at our graduate students who are going to be creating, larger works and stuff, a lot of the tools that I show you are actually just good accessibility rules in general. Okay, so this is beyond kind of the formal format of a thesis or a dissertation, but also just kind of good rules in life for when you are formatting work. Specifically, we're going to be looking in Microsoft Word, but some of the same tools will live in a simpler program like Google Docs or an open source program like LibreOffice as well. All right. So we're going to be covering why you should care, as well as talking about frequently seen accessibility issues, especially the things that I've seen in the thesis that I've had to remediate over the past year to comply with some guidelines that have come up. I actually give you some formatting options in Microsoft Word and some kind of guidance on some places where to find guidance, as well as demo some of the really basic steps for this. We're also going to talk about actually how to save your work in a slightly more stable format as a PDF that does not lose all of the formatting you put into it using Microsoft Word. And then again, finally, where you can find help. Okay. So you should care because it in general just makes your work accessible to scholars who rely on adaptive technology like screen readers, right? This is one of those big pushes that we've seen, specifically because of the changes to Title II of the Americans with Disability Act. This is kind of what is pushing all this accessibility changes right now within the academic sphere. Basically, it's come out that by April 24th, 2026, basically all content that is produced by universities needs to be accessible digitally. So that is why you possibly have heard faculty members scrambling to like make their classes accessible, to add captioning to videos and stuff. But this also is for things that we are publishing, and that is especially something that is going to live kind of in institutional repository, which is what Deep Blue is. Okay. For our graduate students, once you submit your work through the process, a librarian, actually typically me, goes through and like downloads it and then uploads it into Deep Blue. So it's an open access repository of all of the scholarly kind of record of the university. And so to meet those institutional requirements here, and to meet those requirements that are passed by Title IX, we really need to start thinking more holistically and kind of prepping for accessibility at the very start. Okay. So, again, I've been working with graduate students and thesis work for 10 years at this point. I am the person who kind of helped with the legacy project of digitizing everything. And again, in the past year or so, I've really been working with graduate students to make sure that their work is accessible. Now, this might seem like a lot to you, like, oh, there's all these things I have to kind of deal with, but really it's not that much. Word kind of how we actually format things in Word can be really simple. Okay. So there's about four things that I really see a lot of when I was looking at these documents that hadn't been given to me with really kind of any accessibility concepts in mind. So things like headings and other styles not being used properly, right? So kind of doing inline formatting where you're like, this is bold, so this is a header, rather than kind of using the inbuilt tool. And we'll go through each of these individually. But so headings not being used, or heading styles not being used. Tables are kind of poorly formatted and they're a little bit confusing for screen readers when they're not, well formatted. Um, Images and charts without alternative text or captions. These are things that, again, a screen reader can't actually read, like what an image is, right? And even a computer can't necessarily always, and even like a chat GPT kind of LLM thing can't always really describe what is going on in an image, or especially more advanced options and more complicated images like charts and graphs and things. And then this is not necessarily the biggest thing in the world, but it's a pet peeve of mine is when there's like tons of extra spaces and like extra line breaks and stuff, and you're just hitting enter. It messes up the format. So people think, oh, it's a paragraph, but there's nothing in this paragraph. But that's kind of behind the scenes. And that one, again, is a very easy fix to use. And again, pretty much all these issues are fixed using inbuilt tools in Microsoft Word. And actually, one of the biggest helps that you're going to be seeing is this actually guide that was created by my colleagues down in the Ann Arbor's library, and it's their guide to Word for dissertations. And this actually includes a full template that you can download and use to actually work with your thesis. Okay. So just to give you a heads up of what this looks like here. Um, so this is the whole guide as it stands, and the template is listed right at the top, right? They also have additional formatting guidelines from like Rackham and other things. And they also have some workshops, which I'll plug at the end, that will go way more in detail than what I'm able to cover in just this one session. Okay. But again, you'll see that it's not just the template here, but there's also kind of help along the way. So if you haven't started with this template, there's going to be additional help in here too. Okay. So this is one of those places that I would actually have you go look at. And actually, let me open up the template here. There it is. Um, so I've already downloaded it, and you'll see that you can actually just kind of plug and play here where stuff is. You'll also notice that there's going to be within the actual sections is going to be kind of a description of what they are doing within this and how it's actually being formatted and why it's being formatted. So it's both the actual structure that you should be using, but also a description of how to do what is kind of being talked about within like chapter 1 talks about the importance of heading styles and how to kind of use this, right? And then chapter 2 here, for example, talks about creating captions and alternative text, so on and so forth. So this is going to be a really useful tool for those of you who have not completely started or who could kind of easily translate over kind of at an early stage in your process here. Okay. All right. So, the number one thing, and probably the issue that a lot of our students don't know that they can do, is you can actually pre-format styles in Word, and this is going to add format cues to your work kind of behind the scenes on the document that's going to help adaptive technology follow the structure of your work. So if you are reading, like as a sighted person who doesn't, and as a non-computer, basically, if you're reading, you say, oh, this is a short title that's bolded over to the side on its own line. That's probably the heading of the page, right? But to a computer, it only says, oh, this is 5 words of bolded text. Let's move on. Okay. So there's kind of this context that's lost on the other end of it. So you're going to need to use kind of these inbuilt tools to create the section headings. This is the other great thing about this is that it will automatically populate a table of contents when you're using this inbuilt tool. Okay. So on this, I'm just going to open up a brand new Word document here. And so if I'm going to say this is section 1, or I'm going to, put in some section 1, section 2, section 3, right? And then we can even get into things like section 1 point or A, right? Or however kind of you want to actually structure your contents here. All right. Right. So right now, up at the very top of in my word toolbar on the home bar here, it's saying this is all normal text. Okay, this is all normal. This is how we would kind of normally put this. But you'll notice that there's a bunch of other styles here, including a heading 1. And as I kind of move over these, it's actually giving me options on what I could change this to. Okay. And if I expand this down, you'll see that there are definitely other options to do this. So if I actually just say this is section 1, I want to make this a um, heading heading 1 or 2. For the sake of Microsoft Word, you're going to treat heading 1 as kind of your main section. So this is going to be a chapter title. This is going to be like your table of contents title, this kind of thing. So you change it as heading 1, and you'll notice that it changes not only the font, but also the size of the font and the color of the font. Now, if you don't like how this looks, you can modify the style. So if I right click on heading 1, I can go up to modify, and it gives me, hey, what do I want? So if I want to keep it in Arial, I can do that. If I only want it to be a size 14 or size 12, if I want it to be bold, if I want to make sure that it's still black, I can do that. I can even add extra spacing in between and around to kind of mess with the formatting this way. Okay. Again, if you're using the pre-formatted version or the template that's coming from the Ann Arbor library, that has all of this already kind of figured out. And additionally, there's even like more formatting options that you can add in here, but I'm just going to keep it kind of based here. And it actually says what this is. Um, and so I'm going to say, okay, so there's my section 1. So the next time I go down to section 2, that same style is there, which is really nice. Okay. Again, for then when you're thinking if you have any subchapters or subheadings or kind of smaller sections that are contained within like that larger chapter. So section 1.A, for example, this is where I would put that heading to. Okay. And we're going to pretend that I have like a bunch of text in between that's the actual content, right? We're just going to pretend that's what's happening here. And again, within section 1A, if I want to change this, I can actually do this. So I can modify this. Again, I don't want it to be, why is it 13? We're going to keep it as 10. We're going to make it bold. We're going to make it italic this time. And we're going to, again, continue to keep it in Arial. Okay, so again, you can do this. And again, keeping this kind of standard style is a really good way to, again, clue your reader into the kind of structure of your work. And so using these styles is just going to maintain that kind of consistency throughout the entire document. All right. Now, within accessibility, you can have up to, I believe it's 5 levels of headers. I don't suggest you use all 5 unless you absolutely have to, because it does kind of complicate the structure a little bit. So I typically will see up to like 3, maybe 4, because again, you kind of want to like maintain that structure and not make it too terribly complicated for your um, audience. But again, if you needed to, you could. So as this goes on, you have all this. Now, what's really awesome about this is that you can actually create your title. Just add that title there. Okay. And then if I was going to add and needed to add in my table of contents, I could do that too. On the references menu in Microsoft Word, there's this table of contents tool here. You can actually choose a couple of different options. So there's 3 built-in options here, or two automatic ones here. And it will take you out to a level 3. It'll take you out to a level, and it will kind of change like the formatting a little bit here. You can also actually like customize it a little bit if you want to. But basically once I click that, it adds it in automatically. So if I was to go in here and add in a section 3.A, for example, and again, just change the style to that heading 2 structure, then here I can update that table with the entire table, and it adds it in there. It adds in all of those lovely page numbers and everything else. The other thing I can do here is actually say, oh, I need the content to be a heading 1. And so it will kind of add that into so that it kind of maintains that structure going forward. Again, you can edit this to make sure that it's an Arial and to, update the text or font color and everything else too. Um, so again, even though there are these presets within Microsoft Word, you do have the ability to go in and change them and to work with them as we go along. Right. So again, there's additional guidance on working with styles through the University of Michigan or Ann Arbor's library, specifically working with styles and also with table of contents that goes in more detail. Because there are going to be some other types of tables of contents that you might want to use, including like a list of figures and a list of tables. And there are those sections on those help pages. But I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, and I'm going to give you the freedom to go explore that for yourself if you need it, right? Not every thesis or every graduate student is going to need like that full structure. Some people have a lot of figures, some people have only one, some people have none. So things to think about. All right, so that's headers. Um, with tables, so tables are going to be used to present data, right? This is something you're going to see really heavily in the sciences, probably not so much in like literature and arts unless you're doing some like data analysis on text or something. But they should not be used to format content, okay? Um, They should also be used and kind of created within Word rather than copying like as an image and pasting it in, right? We actually want the screen readers to be able to read line by line and kind of understand it rather than having just this like blob kind of plopped in that they don't know what it is. Um, so when you are creating a table with Word, you are going to make sure that you designate a header row or or a header column. Okay. It is best to maintain a basic grid structure so that there aren't any empty cells, there's no skip cells, and you're trying to avoid any split or merge cells because a screen reader can kind of it makes it a little bit confusing for when it's going across, and like trying to read it. Because again, computers are stupid. Like like if it's there, they read it exactly like it is, and so there's sometimes context loss a little bit with that. And also you might are going to need to caption your table. And when caption your table, it typically means you're just putting a figure one or table one and then like a heading for the most part. All right. Um, so what this looks like when you're in a Word document. So say in section 3.A, we need to add a table here. If you go up to insert, and then you have this table option here. And you can choose a variety of options here. You can actually even link out from an Excel spreadsheet. So if you have it already data in Excel, you can kind of bring that in. It does kind of mess up stuff a little bit with the formatting. But it's kind of case dependent on how big the table is. So if you're trying to bring in a lot of data from an Excel sheet, you might have to reformat it a little bit for Word to make it more readable, which is again something you should be doing anyway. Um, so you could draw a table, insert table, but we're going to do a really simple 4 by 4 table here. Okay. So once I've inserted a table like this, it opens up this new table menu in Word here. Okay. I have options to make sure that I have a header row already checked, right? I can actually make sure that things are happening here. I can change the design of my table. I will say be careful if you're using colors. Color contrast is another big issue that is coming up with accessibility, and there are some checkers for that. So, but I would typically stick with black and white or gray to kind of if you are doing kind of any structure like that. I would definitely avoid a lot of these kind of like bigger, more vibrant tables down here. It just doesn't necessarily always work all that well. But you can say, hey, I do have like a header row and I kind of want to make sure that it's um uh visible to my own like sighted readers as well. So adding that little bit of like extra thickness under the header row, awesome. Okay. So these are going to be date. This is going to be time. We've got number of people and rating, right? So again, I'm keeping that really structure all the way across, and that's going to be my headers. So so when so because we're going to be because when we see date, we're going to be expecting everything in that column to be dates. Everything in time is going to be time, people, that sort of thing. Computers and screen readers actually read from left to right and then down. So they will say date, time, number of people, rating, and they will say whatever is in that first column. So if we're going to do February 13th, noon, 16 or 15, whatever I'm typing here. And we've got 4.5, right? And then in the next row here, it will say February 20th, uh, 11:30, 17:3, right? So it's going to read it line by line by line. So when you are thinking about this, if you try to merge a cell like this, so if I was going to try to merge this time, and actually go into layout here, because you can actually like merge cells and stuff. But if I just put in here, like it's kind of taking away that structure that the screen reader is expecting to see. So if I am listening to this reading it February 20th, 11:30, 17:3, and then the next line it goes March 1st, 15, 4.0, right? There's that structure that kind of lost there a little bit. Okay, so that's why we're trying to avoid any of these merge cells and that kind of stuff. And again, so we can unmerge them pretty easily here. All right. And again, there is like other layouts and stuff you can do. So if you want to make them align them center or anything else like that, that really doesn't affect the accessibility too much. But I would again try to keep it pretty standardized across what's going on with this table here. And again, you can actually like include properties and do row and column and stuff to make sure that you have like width and everything else going on. You can even add a title and a description to the alternative text here too. So again, if it is a really complicated option here, this is one way to add that title in there. Otherwise, I would really do just a caption like table one, and then a short title description of what it is. So this is right. It's the record is of webinar attendance at webinars. Okay. And again, if you are including like a list of figures or a list of tables, you can use the styles within your with using the styles that are kind of pre-formatted here to actually format this, and they'll pull into a figure table. Again, I'm not going to get into that because it's a little bit complicated, but there's a lovely example on the Ann Arbor Library page on how to do that. Because basically it creates a secondary table of contents that would list them out separately than the section headers. We actually have through the University of Michigan Flint, our accessibility specialist in ITS has been creating some accessibility guides, and there's one that talks about accessible tables. It's not necessarily specific to Microsoft Word, but again, the UM Ann Arbor Library has a section specifically about tables and also talks about captioning them as well. So those are really great places to look for additional help here. All right, so this is a big one here, is alternative text. All right. So again, as sighted people who, who can read text and like read images and kind of understand what's going on, people who need screen readers and other adaptive technology to read this, they're relying on the computer to actually describe it. And computers don't have eyes. They are reading the metadata that's behind an image, and that's what alternative text is. Okay. So all images, charts, graphs, diagrams should have alternative text, right? And the only images you should be really including in, especially more scholarly work like dissertations and theses should be important to your project, right? If you have an image of like if you're like a biologist and you're an example of like the specimen that you're studying, right? Like that's important to your work. It should be there. We're not necessarily just going to throw clip art all over the place, right? Like we're back in the 90s. Like that's not a thing we should be doing. Um, but so to really get good at alternative text, it should be brief, but it has to contain the same information as the visual context that we're seeing. Okay. And so you need to describe the image's content, but also the purpose behind it. Um, and for some of the charts and graphs that you use, it might just be a pie graph that's kind of showing splits. Sometimes there's more complicated images like scatter plots, or it's a really long bar graph that you can't really get like explain all that detail a in alternative text because again, it should be fairly brief. So describing these complex images takes a little bit longer to do and is a little bit more complicated. And this is where using like an image caption might be helpful and also give context to the sighted person too, to say, hey, this graph is showing this, right? Because again, depending on how big the graph is, and again, if you're copying something over from like an Excel sheet, you kind of are going to need to look at the size of fonts and stuff that you're using. Again, making sure that it's readable to someone. So um, we have some examples of this on both the UM Ann Arbor Library site as well as on our site about graduate thesis and dissertation publishing. And actually, I'm going to take you guys there first because in addition to all of this, we have some links out to this and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But in the making your work accessible section, I have found three kind of sections that really talk about alternative text and making it readable. So section 508 is a government website and it really talks about kind of making the purpose behind alternative text, what it looks like, kind of good and bad, helpful and unhelpful examples. So for example, helpful image is this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Unhelpful black and white photo of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wearing a suit and tie. We don't like, again, the fact that it's in black and white doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. The fact that he's wearing a suit and tie doesn't make a whole lot of difference, right? you can kind of see the different options here. And a lot of this is really kind of geared more for a digital experience when it's coming through like what you're seeing on the web. That's what Section 508 is looking at a little bit. So, but it gives you kind of the basic understanding of like what it should look like. Now, for more complicated images, we have a couple of examples from some academic publishers. So this is DeGrootier, and it talks about scientific publications specifically, because again, that is where we're going to see a lot of images kind of being incorporated into these texts. So for example, we've got some do's and don'ts down here. We also have we have an X-ray image, right? And so the caption that they're giving you is again describing, because I can see this. I'm like, okay, this is definitely a pelvis. I don't know what all this stuff is in here, right? I know it shouldn't be there, but I don't know what it is. So in the caption, they're actually kind of giving you some markers for the pelvic floor. They're talking about what this is. The alt text is just X-ray of pelvis and lumbar spine region. So they're again, like what you visually see is in that alt text, and then the caption gives a little bit more context there. Okay. Similarly with things like maps, right? Caption is talking about the geographical distribution of whatever's going on. And the alt text is the map of the studies areas, which include some of the cities that are being kind of pulled out there, right? So again, the caption and the alt text kind of work hand in hand to provide that context. So that again, for both sighted people and people who are using screen readers and have these kind of adaptive technologies, that it's the same, it's kind of trying to replicate both experiences. Okay. Now, again, these are not the most complicated images we've ever seen, right? There are definitely there are a lot of other things. So degreeter is a really good kind of baseline. This is what you should start thinking about. And then I found also this presentation from Georgia Tech that was given and it's hosted on the National Library of Medicine site. But it actually goes through and really talks about kind of not only general tips, but like really complex kind of images and graphs and things that you might be seeing, right? And things to think about is like cognitive load. Should this be using? Um, so let me scroll. So like things like timelines. How would you try to include this? What does a supply demand curve does, right? So like describing those X and Y axes first to kind of give context for what's going on. For those of you who might be using math and chemistry equations, right? Like if you need brief or you need a more complex kind of look, because again, depending on what you're doing, Microsoft Word doesn't always work well with some of these mathematical functions. So you might be using a different kind of software to include it, like LA Text or something. Again, can't get quite too into that, but you can see like brief versus long descriptions, right? Like this long one, I probably would not use, right? But again, if this is all that you're kind of putting in here, I would put a lot of this into the caption or kind of talk about it in a paragraph surrounding this text and use definitely a briefer caption here or briefer alternative text for this. So again, kind of thinking about this, and this is some of these diagrams are really, really complicated. And so that's why we see kind of the brief one is what you should technically be using in the alt text. And then in the long one is something that you'd see possibly within a caption, but more than likely you're going to be describing that in your work kind of around what you're talking or in around the section that you have this image. Okay. All right. So when you're in Word here, we're going to pop an image down below. And it's not going to be a super, I'm not going to be able to do a full graph and stuff because I did not think about doing that, but I can insert a picture, okay, from this device. You know, you can do stock images, that kind of stuff. You can actually create charts within Microsoft Word, so this might be something to kind of think about going forward, but you can also import them from Excel and other places too. So if I'm going to add a picture from this device here, and we'll just use Egypt here as an example. All right, so I've got this lovely picture. This is a local kind of community organizer, Egypt Otis. She's been working on some stuff in Detroit, and she was working on an archival section. So how I would kind of talk about this is, you know, situating in paragraphs around Egypt's text, like why we're adding this image in here. And then you'll notice that it's opened up a picture format menu up at Word, right? So we can do some color corrections and transparency. We can add things like borders and whatever, but really all we care about here is alt text. right? This is what we're looking for. So it adds up a little alt text side over here. Now, you can have AI just generate a description for me. However, with more complicated images, it will just say a bar graph. That's not enough. That is not enough, right? So we can try something here. And it says a person sitting on a chair next to a record player. And I'm like, this is not a record player. This is not a record player, right? So again, and it gives you the caveat that AI generated content might be incorrect. Of course it is. So you can try it, but more than likely, we're going to say like young black or Egypt Otis, for example, because we should name her. Remember that kind of example of Martin Luther King Jr. here. So Egypt Otis to real, uh, or like if I would actually need like the full thing, um, recorder in preservation lab, right? Something really quickly. So again, who the subject is, if there is any kind of action, and like giving them the situation that they're sitting in. Okay. So again, this is for a more descriptive image. For other things like charts and graphs, you're actually going to want to give like the context of what this graph is describing, what the Y and X axes are, what the kind of data points are within it as well. Okay. All right. And so that alternative text is there. I would also want to put in a brief caption. And this is, again, where we might want to think about resizing this image, but this would be like figure 1. Um, uh, Egypt sitting, or like, I don't know, in the preservation lab or something like that. And if I could spell, that would be wonderful. Okay. All right. So that's really how you add alt text in here. And then like the caption, you can kind of actually even attach it in a way. And that is explained. Hold on a second. Again, on the Microsoft for dissertations, you can actually say like um, how to insert things in here, as well as how to kind of insert captions with this as well. And it's pretty, it is a little bit more complicated to actually add and kind of attach the caption here. But again, this guidance is available on the Microsoft Word for Dissertations guide. Hi everybody, future editor Liz here. Forgot to mention that there's some additional formatting that you need to do in Microsoft Word to, again, make sure that your work is accessible. So one of the big things that I've noticed is that for your work's title, you will need to be using a title case rather than an all capital. And this is going to help to distinguish words specifically for people who have dyslexia or other kind of reading disabilities. And another reason why this is helpful is that, especially for people who are going to be using citation managers, using title case kind of helps those tools disambiguate acronyms and other types of things that should be all caps from normal kind of words. So what this looks like, and the difference between these two items here, is that this thesis by Ashley Booker here has its title in title case, right? So all the important words are capitalized, so connecting, elementary, science, scores. Any kind of unimportant words are not capitalized, so to, for example. And then you do have any acronyms, so NAEP is capitalized completely like it should be. Okay, so this is title case. Instead of something like all caps, like this dissertation is, when even for someone who does not have, a diagnosed disability or anything else like this, or dyslexia, for example, this is still kind of harder to scan when it's all in capitals. So again, this is not something we should be doing. We should instead be using title case like this. Another thing that I've seen some questions about are if there are certain fonts that are better for people with dyslexia, for example. I've done some research and looked to see what the literature was saying, and it's really kind of mixed on whether or not certain fonts are more readable than others, but it's best to use kind of standard or really common fonts just in general. Times New Roman, Arial, for example, very common. I have seen a little bit of positive research when it comes to having a sans serif font like Arial. So again, there's no little extra curly cues or things. But again, there really wasn't a ton of like supportive research for either way. Another thing to think about is that it is good process to kind of avoid slanted or italicized fonts as well, if at all possible. So when we are thinking about kind of formatting things like our headers or anything like that, keeping those like bold or underlined or things instead of italicized might be useful. The last thing that you're going to want to make sure that you have is that your font color should be black. For that, again, that high contrast is what we're looking for here. And it's also a good idea to watch out for your color contrast on any graphs or images that you create, so that again, there is the contrast between what the text is and what like different bars on a bar graph are. This is again to help people who are colorblind or again who have other kind of vision impairments. And we actually have guidance for ensuring basic color contrast accessibility on some of the Flint's accessibility guides. All right, so this is my own pet peeve just because it's one of those things where like people like put extra space and space and space and say like you don't need to do that, except on like maybe your title page and like on a copyright or like getting your dedication like centered or something. There's a couple there are going to be a couple of exceptions to this. However, in kind of the full body of your text, and if you're going to try to having different sections on different pages, use those inbuilt tools. So using page break, adding in line spacing, right? Like using that double space things, and even adding extra space before and after paragraph breaks to kind of, again, help not only really a lot of this is just to kind of help your sighted readers to actually kind of like follow along, like, oh, there's a little bit of extra space here. We're moving to a new moving to a new chapter. Okay. So things we can do here, these are really super simple to do. So for example, here on the contents page, like I don't want the contents on my title page. Like my title page is going to be completely separate here. So I can go up to insert, page break. Ta-da! Right? Section 1, page break. Yay! Section 1A or section 2, page break. Okay. And again, section 3, we will throw another one here, page break. Okay. So again, we can add that in here. And what this does is it really kind of allows you to move things around and like add more space and things. And again, you can always redo this if necessary. Just to give you an example on like a more fully formed example here. This is an example of a thesis that is coming from the biology department, and this is something that they've looked at. And if you've ever turned on the little paragraph marks, this really kind of shows you what is going on kind of within the structure of a document. So you'll see every time there's a little page or a paragraph symbol here, this is another place they've put enter. Okay. So when you're looking at this, when a screen reader is reading this, like, oh, there's paragraph, but it's empty, paragraph empty, paragraph empty. And it, again, may not necessarily do a lot to the screen reader, but it is actually having it kind of work a little bit harder. Whereas if you see page break, okay, we're going to the next section. Page break, we're going to the next section, right? You're kind of seeing what is happening here so that you can kind of maintain that structure going through. This is also where you'll see like the table of contents, like this is actually updated and you can see where this is coming from as well. And again, this is where we have like a list of tables and a list of figures that are pulling in these tables within chapter 1, chapter 2, the figures that are happening within the structure too. So it is possible, and this is what they look like. And again, it's pulling in specifically these areas here. And let's see. There's one more section. So even on here, like the difference between your introduction and your title, chapter 1. Again, it depends a little bit on how much space you want and what it's looking like. But again, there's these little markers that will show you that, oh, this is actually going to come in as a heading 2 here. So you can kind of see what's going on behind the scenes instead of adding in all this extra space for things. All right. The other thing that you can do with this, so for example, if I wanted a little bit of extra space after section 3, for example, just to kind of like make sure I'm giving myself a little extra space here in between either like the title, like the section heading and the paragraphs that are going to be coming afterwards, I can either go up to, if I want to do it manually, you can add space after a line paragraph basically. And what it does is it actually, hold on, do this. So you'll see that it's a paragraph, you'll see that it's a paragraph. If I add extra spacing here, it's going to add and kind of basically add a little bit of space, but it's not adding in a full other line. Okay. And actually, when you're in the modify section, you should be able to add additional space kind of around these different areas. You can even like increase indents and stuff. So, for example, on heading twos, if I wanted to say, hey, we want to like for our sighted readers, like give them a little bit of extra clue here to say, hey, we need to add this in, it'll actually put them all in. Oop, hold on a second. Sorry. My cursor was in the wrong spot, but it adds and it edits all those section twos without you having to like go through line by line by line to find them all too, which is why, again, keeping that consistency is great. Okay. So again, if I wanted to add this in here and modify this to add in a bit of extra space here, I can do that, hit OK. And again, it adds that little bit of space in between things without having you like manually hit enter every single time. And then let me double check. Oh, yes. And then, of course, our line spacing. Hopefully, you guys all know that you can actually choose to have 1.5, 1, 2 to again add in that double space if you need it. Most of the time, I will see a 1.5 or 1.15 or 1.5 in most of the kind of published things. I don't necessarily see a full double spacing just because when you are going to try to print out 30 plus pages of a thesis, right? And the double spacing is really nice for faculty who are going to be, marking it up and like wanting to add and kind of write in around it. But for printing it out, again, you can use the double space, but most of the time I definitely see slightly less space in between individual lines. But again, it's going to be dependent upon kind of your field and what the expected kind of outcome is. And additionally, what your advisors are going to say, your chairs. All right, so you're now, once you have everything done and you've been signed off and everything's great, you've completed, yay! You are going to want to save your work in a slightly more stable file, right? That's not as easily editable. PDFs are still editable. Actually, this is what I use to kind of remediate. Like I'm able to go in and edit PDFs and remediate them for accessibility purposes using Adobe Acrobat. Okay. This is kind of one of the standard programs that are out there, and we actually have free access to it through the university. We have access to the entire Adobe Cloud actually. But basically, in order to kind of make sure that you are maintaining your document in again, not as easily editable form because not everybody has access to it. You're going to want to save your document as a PDF to maintain all of that you've been working on, okay? Because if you ever do a print to PDF, what that does is it basically creates an image of your work with just a PDF, and none of the formatting is actually supported. It kind of wipes all of that away, all right? So as an example here, if I was going to go in and file and then print to PDF, which I'll show you what happens. Right? So again, I'm in the printer. It says it's going to an Adobe PDF, but what will happen, and I'll open it up in a second here once it downloads. This is the thesis example here, and it has print up here. So this is the same thing that I just did. Now, if I run an accessibility check on this, it's going to come back with a bunch of issues, right? Like it's not even sure that this is in English, right? It doesn't know what the title is. There's no alternative text. Like there's so many issues with this, right? Whereas if I had saved this as a PDF, what comes back is still the same document, but there's a lot less issues that are kind of coming through this. Okay. There's still a few. Again, you can't always get everything correctly. Like, so there's a couple of alternative images that for whatever reason, they're not quite reading correctly. So I might want to go and try to fix this. So for whatever reason, it just didn't happen when I was initially doing it. So again, it may not catch everything, but this is a good kind of check to make sure that's kind of going forward. Okay. But even before you get to this stage, actually within Microsoft Word, there is a accessibility check that you can do here, right? It'll actually ask you, hey, you might want to look at the alt text here. You can actually run a check in here. So, okay, there's definitely some things that are kind of missing in here. And again, depending on what this is, I'm like, I don't understand what this is, so I might just need to delete that, right? So there is some accessibility checking you can do within Microsoft Word, especially if you've already really started on your document and you don't want to rewrite it and redo it. This is a good way to kind of like make sure that everything is going forward. So again, like I don't know what this is. There's nothing there, so I'm going to delete it, right? Same thing with this one. Good. Don't know why that's there. Going to delete that out. Okay. Um, and then there's going to be a couple of things that'll pull up back that there's something with contrast. And like, I don't know what's happening up there. So we'll probably delete that out there. Oh, it looks like it's maybe a tracked change that didn't get done or something weird here. So I can change that into like, you know, uh, instead of red, it's going to be blue, black. So again, there is a nice little check in here. It doesn't grab everything. So it's kind of a combination between Microsoft Word and Adobe that you might be working with. When you do submit your work to the ProQuest accessibility or the ProQuest ETD administrator, and like that's where we actually like kind of get all your information and like you upload the PDF there. When I download that PDF and before I put it into Deep Blue, I run my own, I run it also through Adobe Accessibility Checker just to double check things. Most of the time I don't find anything and I might have to fix the heading structure a little bit, but otherwise it really is like not that big of a deal and doesn't take a ton of time. Okay. So you can actually, use the accessibility checkers in multiple ways. And you can even like, kind of understand like what the read aloud happens. And so if you're trying to specifically, like if you have a table and you want to experience like what a screen reader does, like the read aloud is actually a really nice feature. So you can kind of see what is actually happening with that too. Okay. So, where you can find help. The graduate thesis and dissertation publishing page through the Flint Library has links to everything I've shown you today. Okay. You can always email me or make an appointment with me. And then I will also plug that there are two upcoming webinars from the UM Ann Arbor Library that are specifically about Microsoft Word and kind of formatting your papers within Word. They are open to UM Flint students. You just register for them. I've got links to this and I will be sharing links out to this presentation. But yeah, they definitely go way more in depth than I was able to give you kind of, and again, they're not as accessibility focused in there, but they are getting a little bit more because of it's a requirement coming down. But I really wanted to focus on the really specific accessibility issues that you guys are probably going to be coming up here with. Thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Find upcoming webinars to register for at libcal.umflint.edu.